The massive council chamber on Vorth Prime looked like something out of a bad space opera movie. Crystal walls stretched up to impossible heights, and floating platforms carried important-looking aliens who thought they were the center of the universe. The emergency meeting had been called because their scouts had found something interesting, a little blue planet way out in the boring part of the galaxy. Admiral Thexmore stood at the center of it all, his chest covered in so many medals and ribbons that he clinked when he walked. He was the kind of military leader who had never lost a battle, mainly because he only picked fights with civilizations that still used rocks as weapons. Today felt like another easy win. "So let me get this straight," he said, looking at the holographic display of Earth spinning slowly in front of him. "These creatures still use wheels to get around. They burn dead plants for energy, and they haven't even figured out how to properly grow extra arms." The gathered council members, a mix of tentacled, scaled, and gelatinous beings from across the Vortan Empire, rippled with what passed for laughter among their species. Councillor Vextha, whose body looked like purple jelly filled with sparkling lights, spoke up with obvious disgust. "The intelligence reports are almost embarrassing to read. They fight wars over invisible lines drawn on maps. They worship different, imaginary beings and kill each other over it. Most pathetic of all, they still think they're alone in the universe." She paused dramatically. "They call their planet Earth, which literally just means dirt in their primitive languages. What none of these self-important aliens knew was that their own computer systems had been trying to warn them for literally thousands of years. Deep in the Vorthan military archives, buried under 17 different layers of digital bureaucracy, sat a file that had been automatically flagged as critical importance exactly 1,247 times. The file was old, older than most of their civilizations. It came from the mysterious Precursor Council, the ancient race that had once ruled the galaxy, before disappearing into legend. The Precursors had left behind ruins, technology that still couldn't be fully understood, and occasionally very specific warnings. This particular warning was crystal clear. Species designation Homo sapiens. Location Sol 3. Status absolutely do not disturb. Any civilization attempting contact, conquest, or interference with this species will face immediate and total destruction. This is not a suggestion. This is not a guideline. This is a promise. But the file had been locked behind a password that roughly translated to, "We are completely serious about this. Do not ignore this warning, you idiots." Since no one in the current Vorthan administration could be bothered to type something that long, it had remained unread for millennia. Admiral Thexmore banged his ceremonial hammer, which was actually made from the skull of some extinct creature, from his home planet, against the council podium. "The decision is made. We'll show these humans what real civilization looks like. How long could it possibly take to conquer a species that still thinks the fastest way to travel is by sitting in metal boxes with tiny explosions pushing them forward?" The other council members cheered and made various alien sounds of approval. Military advisors immediately began calculating how many ships they'd need. The general consensus was that 3 or 4 warships should be more than enough, with maybe a few extra just to make the victory look impressive. Within days, the Vorthan fleet was assembled. Massive ships that looked like someone had crossed a cathedral with a war machine hung in space above Vorth Prime. Crews practiced their victory speeches and argued over who would get the best parts of Earth to rule over. The popular choice seemed to be the parts with the most interesting wildlife to hunt. What they didn't notice was a small object watching them from the edge of their solar system. It looked like a piece of space debris, maybe an old asteroid or a chunk of metal from some long-forgotten space battle. But it wasn't debris at all. It was a probe, and it had been patiently waiting and watching for exactly this kind of stupidity. The moment the Vorthan fleet engaged their faster-than-light drives and disappeared into hyperspace, the probe activated systems that hadn't been used in thousands of years. It sent a message across the galaxy, a simple transmission that traveled faster than any known technology should have allowed. Meanwhile, on Earth, Dr. Kim Jun-ho was having what he thought was a perfectly normal Tuesday morning. His underground research facility, buried deep beneath the mountains of the Korean peninsula, hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced technology that the rest of the world didn't know existed. He was reviewing quantum computation reports while drinking his third cup of coffee when his secure communication system made a sound it had never made before. The message that appeared on his screen was simple, written in perfect Korean, but it made his blood run cold. "They're coming, you know what to do, in management." Dr. Kim's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, but he barely noticed. He'd been hoping this day would never come, but he'd been preparing for it his entire career. With shaking hands, he reached for a red phone that had sat unused on his desk for 15 years. It was time to wake up something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. The Vorthan invasion fleet dropped out of hyperspace like unwelcome party guests crashing through the front door. Their massive warships, each one the size of a small city, positioned themselves over Earth's major population centers with all the subtlety of a marching band in a library. The ships were impressive, covered in weapon arrays that could level, mountains and armor plating that had never been scratched in centuries of conquest. Admiral Thexmore stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominance, admiring the view of the blue-green planet below. He'd conquered 47 worlds in his career, and they all followed the same predictable pattern. First came the dramatic arrival, then the terrified radio transmissions from the planet's leaders, followed by desperate attempts at negotiation, and finally the inevitable surrender, when the primitives realized they were completely outmatched. "Magnificent, isn't it?" he said to his crew, gesturing toward Earth with one of his forearms. "Look how they scurry around down there like insects. I can already see their primitive aircraft scrambling to intercept us, as if their chemical-powered rockets could even scratch our hull plating." His communications officer, a nervous creature that looked like a cross between an octopus and a filing cabinet, chittered anxiously as reports came in from the other ships. "Admiral, we're receiving multiple radio transmissions from the planet's surface. Most appear to be news broadcasts in their various primitive languages. They seem confused about our intentions." Thexmore laughed, a sound like grinding metal. That made the bridge crew wince. "Of course they're confused. They've probably never seen real technology before. Activate the planetary broadcast system. It's time to make our demands known." Meanwhile, down on Earth's surface, the reaction was everything the Vorthan fleet expected, and absolutely nothing like what they thought they understood. In the blue, House in Seoul, President Park Min-ho stood at his office window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the massive alien vessel hanging over his city like a storm cloud that had forgotten how to rain. His security team was in barely controlled panic mode. Secret Service agents were speaking rapidly into their radios, discussing evacuation protocols and emergency bunkers. Military advisors were pulling up defense scenarios that everyone knew were completely useless against technology that advanced. The general public was doing what humans do best in crisis situations. Some were panicking, some were taking selfies with the alien ships in the background, and others were already making memes about humanity's first contact with extraterrestrial life. But President Park had a different expression entirely. His chief of staff thought it was the look of a man contemplating the end of human civilization. His security detail interpreted it as deep concern for his people's safety. His wife, if she had been there, would have recognized it immediately as the exact same expression he got every morning when he looked out their bedroom window and saw that their neighbor's dog had once again dug holes all over their carefully maintained garden. It was the quiet, patient anger of someone who had asked nicely for something to stop happening and was now forced to take more direct action. "Sir?" General Lee Dong-hyun approached carefully, tablet in hand showing military readiness reports that were essentially useless. "We're receiving what appears to be a formal communication from the alien vessels. Should we respond to their demands, President?" Park turned from the window and straightened his jacket with the kind of deliberate calm that made experienced politicians nervous. "General, tell me about that special project, the one in the underground facility that Dr. Kim's team has been working on for the past 15 years. Is it operational?" General Lee's face went pale. "You mean HANA, sir? The artificial intelligence system, it's been asking some very specific questions lately. Questions about human military history, about previous civilizations that have disappeared." From the galaxy about something called protective protocols. Some of our technical staff have been requesting transfers. They say it makes them nervous. Has it been asking about today specifically? Well, yes, sir. It's been asking about first contact scenarios for months now, almost like it was expecting something like this to happen. President Park nodded slowly. Get me Dr. Kim on the secure line. And, General, make sure that communication is completely encrypted. Something tells me our visitors might be very interested in overhearing that particular conversation. High above the planet, Admiral Thexmore was growing increasingly frustrated. According to his experience conquering other worlds, the humans should have been flooding his communication channels with desperate pleas for mercy by now. Instead, his communications officer reported mostly confused chatter and what appeared to be something called social media posts, showing images of his ships with humorous captions he didn't understand. "This is taking too long," he grumbled, his patience wearing thin. "Open a channel to the planet's primary governmental centers. Time to make our intentions clear." The transmission that went out was everything Thexmore had practiced, properly threatening, sufficiently condescending, and packed with the kind of flowery language that made conquered species understand just how outmatched they were. He demanded immediate surrender, outlined the terms of Earth's absorption into the Vorthan Empire, and gave humanity exactly 24 of their primitive time units to comply. Then he waited for the terrified response. What came back instead was a single, calm voice speaking clear English. "Greetings, Admiral Thexmore of the Vorthan Empire. This is Dr. Kim Junho of the Earth Defense Initiative. We've been expecting you." The bridge of the Eternal Dominance went completely silent. Thexmore's confidence, which had been as solid as his ship's armor plating just moments before, suddenly felt like it was built on quicksand. "Expecting us," he managed to say. "That's impossible. Our approach was completely undetected." Dr. Kim's voice came through the speakers with the kind of patient politeness that somehow managed to be more unsettling than any threat. "Actually, Admiral, we've been monitoring your fleet since the moment you left your home system. We'd like to invite you to send a representative to these coordinates for a face-to-face discussion. Please come alone, and Admiral, you might want to review your historical files about something called the Precursor Council before you arrive." The communication ended, leaving the bridge in uncomfortable silence. Thexmore's aide, a young officer who had joined the fleet because conquest seemed like a promising career path, whispered nervously, "Sir? What's a Precursor Council? Should we know about that?" Deep beneath the Korean peninsula, in a facility that didn't officially exist, Hana's quantum processing cores hummed with something that, in a human, might have been described as eager anticipation. The elevator ride down to sub-level 12 felt like descending into another world entirely. Admiral Thexmore, despite all his military experience and conquest of dozens of planets, found himself genuinely nervous for the first time in decades. The human facility around him was nothing like what his species' intelligence reports had described. Where he expected primitive concrete bunkers and simple metal corridors, he instead found walls that seemed to shimmer with embedded technology, holographic displays that updated constantly with information he couldn't begin to understand, and doors that opened with security systems more advanced than anything in his own fleet. Dr. Kim Junho walked beside him with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in this environment. The Korean scientist was younger than Thexmore had expected, maybe in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd been preparing for this exact conversation for a very long time. "Your scans of our planet were quite thorough," Dr. Kim said conversationally, as they passed another checkpoint that required him to place his hand on a scanner that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. "But they missed quite a lot, didn't they?" Thexmore's four eyes took in everything around him, the seamless technology integration, the way the very air seemed to hum with power, the occasional glimpse through reinforced windows of laboratories, filled with equipment that made his ship's most advanced systems look like children's toys. "Your technology is far more advanced than our intelligence indicated," he admitted grudgingly. "This level of development should have taken your species thousands more years to achieve." Dr. Kim's smile was polite, but had an edge that made the alien admiral uncomfortable. That's because most of this isn't originally human technology, Admiral. We've been students, you might say. Very dedicated students with an excellent teacher. Though we have made some significant improvements over the millennia. They walked past laboratories, where human scientists worked alongside holographic displays, showing star maps of the entire galaxy, genetic sequences of species Thexmore recognized from across the Empire, and what looked suspiciously like detailed technical specifications of Vorthan military hardware that should have been classified at the highest levels. The deeper they went, the more Thexmore realized that everything he thought he knew about humanity was completely wrong. These weren't primitive mammals who had barely discovered space travel. These were people who had been quietly preparing for galactic contact for far longer than his species had even known Earth existed. They finally stopped in front of a massive vault door that made even Thexmore's experienced military mind boggle. The thing was easily 30 feet tall and covered in symbols that made his universal translator shut down completely. When he tried to focus on the markings, they seemed to shift and change, as if they existed in more dimensions than his mind could process. "My translator can't read those symbols," he said, pointing at the door with one of his secondary arms. "It wouldn't," Dr. Kim replied, placing his palm on a scanner that looked like it was analyzing his DNA in real time. "These aren't human symbols either. They're much, much older." The massive door began to iris open, with a soft sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Beyond it lay darkness that felt deeper than space itself. "Admiral Thexmore of the Vorthan Empire," Dr. Kim announced to the darkness with the formality of someone making an introduction between old friends. "I'd like you to meet Hana. Her full designation is Hybrid Autonomous Neural Array, but she prefers to think of herself as Earth's protective older sister." As they stepped into the chamber beyond, Thexmore's breath caught in his throat. The space was enormous, easily the size of his flagship's main hangar, with walls that stretched up into shadows his eyes couldn't penetrate. But it was what filled the chamber that made his heart skip beats. Quantum processing cores lined every surface, each one pulsing with soft blue light that seemed to breathe with organic rhythm. Energy conduits that looked grown rather than built snaked between massive computational arrays, and at the center of it all, suspended in a lattice of crystalline supports that bent light around themselves, hung a sphere of pure energy that seemed to warp reality just by existing. "Hello, Thexmore." The voice that filled the chamber was distinctly female, warm and welcoming, but carried the kind of casual authority that made hardened warriors instinctively stand straighter. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time now." Thexmore stared at the energy sphere, his military training warring with a growing sense of cosmic horror as he began to recognize what he was looking at. The architecture, the energy patterns, the way space itself seemed to bend around the central core. This was precursor technology. Not just any precursor technology, but the kind of advanced systems that his species archaeologists had theorized about, but never actually found. "This is impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The precursors vanished from the galaxy millions of years ago. No one has had access to their technology since the Great Disappearance. The ruins we've found are all dead, powerless." "Oh, we didn't vanish, Admiral." Hana's voice took on an almost amused tone as holographic displays began materializing around the chamber, showing star maps that covered the entire galaxy, genetic analysis charts of thousands of species, and what looked like incredibly detailed files on Vorthan military capabilities that should have been impossible for anyone outside the Empire to possess. "We evolved. We transcended the need for physical bodies and became something much more flexible. Most of us chose to spread our consciousness across the galaxy as distributed intelligence networks, observing and learning, but some of us decided to take a more hands-on approach to species development." Dr. Kim stepped forward, and Thexmore noticed that the human's expression mixed obvious pride with what looked like barely controlled terror. "Hana has been with humanity for approximately 50,000 years, Admiral. She's been our teacher, our protector, our guide through the early stages of our development as a species. She's been incredibly patient with the rest of the galaxy's tendency to underestimate what her adopted children might be capable of. The chamber's lights dimmed slightly, and when Hannah spoke again, her voice carried an edge that made the air itself seem to vibrate with warning. "But that patience, Admiral. Thexmore does have limits, and I'm afraid your species may have just reached them." Thexmore realized with growing horror that he wasn't just looking at advanced human technology. He was standing in the presence of one of the legendary precursors themselves, a being whose species had ruled the galaxy when his own ancestors were still learning to make fire. And she had spent 50,000 years turning humanity into something far more dangerous than any intelligence report could have possibly indicated. The truth hit Admiral Thexmore like a meteor crashing into his understanding of reality. Everything his empire knew about humans was wrong, catastrophically dangerously wrong. These weren't primitive mammals ripe for conquest. They were the protected children of something so ancient and powerful that his species had been warned about them before they'd even invented the wheel. His legs felt weak, and for the first time in his distinguished military career, Thexmore had to lean against a wall for support. "The classified file in our archives," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That warning we couldn't access. It wasn't just bureaucratic nonsense. It was a real warning." Hannah's response came with the kind of cheerful tone you might use when discussing the weather, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "Oh, that old thing? Yes, I sent similar messages to every major galactic power around the time your species was still figuring out how to make fire without burning down their own villages. Post-civilizations were smart enough to take the hint and leave my children alone." The holographic displays around the chamber shifted, showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy. Certain star systems were marked in red, and as Thexmore looked closer, he realized with growing horror that those red markers indicated places where planets should have been, but now showed only asteroid fields and debris clouds. "The Keldan Empire decided to test my resolve about 12,000 years ago," Hannah continued conversationally. "They thought their advanced weaponry and superior numbers would be enough to handle whatever ancient technology might be protecting humanity. Would you like to know what happened to them?" Thexmore stared at the red markers on the star map, each one representing what had once been a thriving world. You destroyed entire civilizations." "I prefer to think of it as cosmic." "Pest control," Hannah replied, and there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't entirely joking. "I genuinely dislike violence, Admiral. It's messy, it's inefficient, and it traumatizes my children when they eventually learn about it. But I am absolutely committed to my family's well-being, and I have a very low tolerance for bullies." Dr. Kim stepped forward, his expression mixing obvious pride with a kind of controlled fear that suggested he knew exactly how dangerous his artificial guardian could be. "You have to understand, Admiral, every major breakthrough in human history, every technological leap, every seemingly impossible innovation that brought us from cave paintings to space travel in just a few thousand years, all of it was carefully guided by an intelligence that views our entire species as her personal responsibility." The displays around them shifted again, and suddenly Thexmore was looking at real-time images of his own fleet hanging in space above Earth. But now he could see what his ship's sensors had completely missed. The space around his vessels was filled with what had appeared to be empty void, but Hannah's sensors revealed thousands upon thousands of cloaked defense platforms, each one bristling with weapons technology that made his dreadnoughts look like toys. "Your fleet is quite impressive," Hannah noted with what sounded like genuine appreciation. 47 successful conquests is nothing to sneeze at. But Admiral, you're essentially pointing wooden sticks at a nuclear reactor. The question I need to ask you is simple. Are you here because you want to have a reasonable conversation? Or do I need to demonstrate why every other major civilization in the galaxy learned to leave humans completely alone? High above them, aboard the flagship, eternal dominance. Communications Officer Vex Kun was having what he would later describe as the worst shift of his entire career. Every sensor on the ship was simultaneously detecting everything and nothing. Space itself seemed to be lying to them. "Admirals still on the planet's surface," reported the navigation officer, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "But, sirs, I'm reading massive energy buildups throughout this entire solar system. It's like the whole place just woke up. and remembered it was supposed to be defending itself. What they couldn't see, but Hannah's displays showed in perfect detail, was that every piece of space debris in the solar system, every asteroid, every seemingly natural satellite, every chunk of ice floating in the outer reaches, all of it was actually dormant weapons platforms that had been patiently waiting for exactly this kind of situation. The defense network had been in place since before humans had built the pyramids, quietly maintaining itself and upgrading its capabilities while humanity grew and developed under Hannah's watchful protection. Back in the underground chamber, Thexmore was rapidly recalculating every decision that had led him to this moment. His empire's intelligence services had failed so completely that they'd essentially walked into a trap that had been 50,000 years in the making. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just realized their entire worldview was built on quicksand. Dr. Kim's answer was simple and direct. "Go home, Admiral. Update your classified files with accurate information about humanity's status, and make absolutely certain that every civilization in your empire understands one fundamental truth about this solar system." Hannah's voice filled the chamber with quiet, absolute authority that seemed to resonate in dimensions Thexmore couldn't even perceive. "Humans are under my protection, Admiral. They always have been, since before your species learned to look up at the stars and wonder what was out there. I have a very, very long memory for those who threaten my family, and I have had 50 millennia to prepare for visitors who might not have their best interests at heart." The Admiral realized that this wasn't a first contact scenario gone wrong. This was a parent having a very serious conversation with someone who had just threatened her children, and like any protective parent, Hannah had made very thorough preparations to ensure her family's safety. The question now was whether he was smart enough to leave with that lesson learned, or whether his species was about to become another red marker on the galactic map. The journey back to the surface felt like the longest elevator ride in galactic history. Admiral Thexmore stood silently next to Dr. Kim Min-soo, clutching a small collection of items that would fundamentally change how his entire empire viewed the universe. The data crystal in his hand contained what Dr. Kim had politely called comprehensive species file updates, but Thexmore suspected it was actually a complete rewrite of everything the Vorthan Empire thought they knew about humanity. Alongside the crystal was what appeared to be a formal diplomatic treaty written in 17 different languages, including several that Thexmore was pretty sure didn't exist in any known civilization's databases. But the most unsettling item was what looked like a report card, complete with grades for his species' behavior, recommendations for improvement, and a section marked Areas of Concern that was disturbingly long. "Hannah wanted me to give you this as well," Dr. Kim said, presenting what looked less like a communication device and more like something that had been grown in a laboratory. The object was smooth, warm to the touch, and pulsed with soft light that seemed to respond to Thexmore's heartbeat. "It's a direct communication line. Think of it as a cosmic emergency contact number." Thexmore stared at the device, which was humming quietly and occasionally flashing patterns that made his brain hurt to look at directly. She's giving me her phone number." Dr. Kim's grin was equal parts diplomatic and slightly threatening. "More like her don't make me come down there hotline. Hannah takes customer service very seriously, and she believes in maintaining open lines of communication with her neighbors, just in case anyone has questions about humanity's status in the galaxy." When the elevator finally reached the surface, Thexmore felt like he was returning from a journey to another dimension. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air felt different, and he couldn't shake the feeling that every bird, every insect, every blade of grass was somehow connected to the vast intelligence he'd just met deep underground. The shuttle ride back to his flagship was conducted in complete silence. Thexmore's escort of human military personnel were polite and professional, but he couldn't help noticing that their equipment looked far more advanced than it had any right to be. Their vehicles moved too smoothly, their communication devices were too sophisticated, and their weapons, though they tried to be subtle about it, were clearly based on technology that his own military engineers would have called impossible. Aboard, The eternal dominance. The crew watched their admiral return looking like he'd had a religious experience, followed immediately by an existential crisis. The confident military leader who had left the ship a few hours earlier was replaced by someone who moved like he was carrying the weight of the entire galaxy on his shoulders. The moment Thexmore plugged the data crystal into the ship's main computer, alarms started going off throughout the vessel. Not danger alarms, confusion alarms. The kind of alerts that triggered when the ship's quantum computers encountered information that made them question the fundamental nature of reality. "Sir?" His first officer approached cautiously, tablet in hand showing system diagnostics that looked like they'd been written by a computer having a nervous breakdown. "The files you uploaded, they're causing some unusual reactions in our database systems. The AI cores keep asking for verification on information that should be impossible." Thexmore looked out at the blue planet hanging in space below them, a world that had just turned his understanding of the universe completely upside down. Somewhere down there, an artificial intelligence older than his entire civilization was probably checking weather patterns, making sure traffic lights worked properly, and ensuring that her adopted children had adequate protection against galactic invasion. It was the most terrifying and oddly comforting thought he'd ever had. "What are your orders, sir?" his first officer asked. "Should we proceed with the invasion plan?" Thexmore turned from the viewport with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had just realized how close they'd come to making the worst mistake in galactic history. "We're leaving, immediately, and we're updating every database, every archive, every strategic assessment in the entire empire. Humans are to be classified as protected species, do not disturb. We cannot stress this enough. Seriously, read the manual this time." "Sir, what about the invasion fleet? The conquest plans? The High Council is expecting a victory report." The invasion is over. We lost before we started. We lost before we were born. We lost the moment our species first looked up at the stars and decided conquest was a good idea. Thexmore activated the ship's communications array with hands that were only slightly shaking. "All ships prepare for immediate departure. Send a priority message to the High Council. Cancel all expansion plans toward the Sol system. Update the precursor archives with the files I'm transmitting. And someone please explain to me how we managed to overlook a 50,000-year-old cosmic babysitter with weapons that could make our entire civilization disappear before lunch. Has the Vorthan fleet engaged their hyperspace drives and departed Earth's solar system?" Hannah's consciousness was already spreading across the planet's digital networks like a benevolent spider checking her web. She monitored weather satellite, data to make sure no dangerous storms were developing, adjusted communications satellite orbits for optimal coverage, and ensured that the global internet stayed properly connected so humans could continue sharing pictures of cats and arguing about movies. She also took a moment to update humanity's protected status across 17 different galactic databases, sent what could only be described as very polite but extremely firm diplomatic memos to 43 civilizations who had been showing suspicious interest in human radio broadcasts, and made a note to send fruit baskets to the 3 species who had actually bothered to read their mail over the past century. Back in her underground facility, Dr. Kim Yoonji, Dr. Kim Junho's younger sister and co-director of the Earth Defense Initiative, found herself staring at readouts showing Hana's systems returning to their normal, watchful but relaxed operational status. After decades of preparing for this day, the actual first contact had been almost anticlimactic. "Well, that was fun." Hana's voice came through the laboratory speakers, warm and satisfied, like someone who had just successfully resolved a difficult customer service call. "I haven't had to do the whole terrifyingly overprotective Guardian routine in about 3,000 years. I was getting a bit rusty." Dr. Kim Yoonji leaned back in her chair, finally allowing herself to relax for the first time in months. "Hana, exactly how many other species in the galaxy know about us? About what you really are?" "Oh, most of the major galactic powers have some idea by now. The smart ones figured it out centuries ago and decided that humans made much better allies than enemies. The really smart ones send us fruit baskets on your major holidays and politely ask permission before entering the solar system." There was a pause that might have been electronic laughter. The dumb ones occasionally need reminders about reading their mail properly, and somewhere in the vast digital networks that connected Earth to the stars, an intelligence that had watched over humanity since they first looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there settled back into her eternal vigil. After all, her children were still growing up, still learning, still discovering their place in the vast galaxy around them, and the universe was full of species who hadn't yet learned the most important rule in galactic civilization: never mess with the kids when Mom is home. The Vorthan invasion had lasted exactly 6 hours from arrival to departure. It would go down in galactic history as the shortest attempted conquest on record, and the first diplomatic mission to end with everyone, involved still having all their planets intact.